Oh, Andrew, you can try.
Okay, we're going to get started here. My name is Rob Bird. I'm going to be hosting your ground truth track today. I'd like to welcome everybody to the first machine learning and math track at any conference held ever, well, at least in security. So thank you all for your interest and your excitement about this. First up is Mike Reutemann with Risk.io, and he's going to do a presentation here on the power law of information. So with that, Mike, we'll let you take it away.
Cool. I feel really sporty in a track jacket. All right. So many empirical quantities, they cluster around a typical value. The dice rolls in these casinos, the number of reporters in the wall of sheep, the pressure, the sea level, and the temperature on a sunny day at Black Hat. All of these things have an average, and their distributions sometimes shift away a negligible amount from the typical value, sometimes maybe an order of magnitude off. But for the most part, they stay within their representative samples. So it's a really useful statement to say that it's really fucking hot in Vegas in August every time Black Hat happens, because it never really deviates from that. Even in the largest deviations, which are exceptionally rare, it can be a factor or two away. It can be 70 degrees, it can be 110. But the distribution is really well characterized by quoting its mean and standard deviation. However, that's not true for everything, and that's what this talk is going to be about. The times that matter to you as information security practitioners when the mean and the standard deviation just can't capture what's going on. So my name is Alex Hutton, and I model risk for a small too-big-to-fail bank. Last year, like every other day, I woke up and I built a risk model. And since we're a bank, we track the prices of a lot of things. So for one of those widgets, I built a price distribution model. This one is a normal distribution, and I assumed that the standard deviation was about 3%, which is a typical number for price fluctuation in a financial market. And my boss used this to make some decisions, and we were quite happy. We made millions from the everyday price fluctuations. However, today we are fucked, because today is Black Monday, October 19th, 1987, and the S&P drops by 21%. My boss freaks out, the firm is in financial ruin, and my kids starve. So how did this happen? Under my model, the probability of a 21% fluctuation is 10 to the negative 16th, which is 0. So what happened? The distribution of price actually has a really fat tail. In fact, the mistake I made was using a normal distribution. Let's take a look at what happens if we use a simple power law distribution instead. So this is a student's distribution with 3 degrees of freedom as the power law. And now the chance of a 21% fluctuation is actually 0.08%, which is something that my risk model would have certainly included and certainly would have changed our behavior on the markets. The good news is that most financial firms actually practice this and they use these models because they've had those massive Black Monday failures many times over. But in information security, we're just not there yet. We haven't had those failures guide us the right way. So often, Russell Thomas likes to point out, people mistake what they did not predict for a black swan. However, what makes a black swan event is not the event itself. It's rather how that event fits into the object observer system. What that means really specifically for us is how your vulnerability management practice or your risk management practice observes those risk swans and makes those black swans and makes assumptions about the risk that they pose. So in fact, the paradigm shift to using a power law distribution instead of a normal distribution to describe many of the variables that we use in information security explains away plenty of the things that we consider black swans by making the object observer system more receptive to those rare high-impact events. The really simple way to think about this is something like the target breach, which if you look at the distribution of breaches beforehand and model it with a normal distribution, you probably wouldn't have thought that it would have had that high of an impact. If you model it as a power law distribution using the past data, it's safe to assume that that was an event that had some tangible probability of happening. So, in fact, nothing is linear in information security, and I have some evidence of this which I'll present, and I don't have evidence for some of it as well. This is an ongoing process. But I want to make the claim that just about every variable we use is power law distributed, and I'll explain why I think that's true. This talk is about power laws that occur in InfoSec, and I've done some research. I just hope to make everybody think twice about using the normal distribution in any model again. So what are power laws? Power laws are distributions that describe scale-free phenomenon. What this means in layman's terms is that the same mechanism works across any range of orders of magnitude or scales. In fact, power laws are a necessary and sufficient condition for this kind of scale-free phenomenon. What that really means is that if attackers behave the same way at, the scale where they have 10,000 breaches a day versus one breach, where they perpetrate 10,000 breaches a day versus one breach a day, the mechanism under which they do those attacks and the mechanisms under which they interact with defenders should be the same. And we'll see how that's true later. The importance and the ubiquity of scale-free behavior was first pointed out by Mandelbrot, who coined the term fractals. And that's what we see in nature. That's what you see in all these geometric shapes that no matter how far you zoom in or zoom out, look exactly the same. In fractals, the behavior can be the same across length, time, price, or any other relevant variable. So think of that when you think about the distributions I'm about to show you. A quantity is said to follow a power law if it's drawn from a probability distribution that looks kind of like that. Alpha is a constant parameter of the distribution. It's known as the scaling parameter. And typical scaling parameters are in the 2 to 3 range, but there are exceptions, and InfoSec is one of those exceptions, I think. So lots of things follow power laws. The oldest and cleanest statistical regularity in our understanding of international relations, or more specifically combat, is Richardson's law, which was from 1948. And his law states that the severity of warfare is power law distributed. Richardson was actually a doctor and a soldier and a statistician. He collected data about the severity of casualties in wars over time and found that that distribution closely mirrored a power law distribution. And since then, as more data has come in, as we've gotten more data, or collected more data, we see that this holds true. And this behavior is not unique to wars, but I wanted to talk about the war analogy first because information security is a lot like that. There's an attacker and a defender, and there's some kind of cost to that interaction. And so if it occurs in human combat, there's no reason why when we scale it up, when we make it electronic and move faster and have more variables, it wouldn't hold to the same distribution principles. But this behavior also occurs in traffic jams and earthquakes, in coastlines, asteroid impacts, language, wealth, firm size, salaries, guild sizes in World of Warcraft, you name it. These power laws are considered fingerprints of a complex system. So in academia, what they mean by complex is this shifting concept. Nobody really knows. But essentially the things that we can glean out of their definition of complex is that these systems produce patterned outputs, but these outputs have no standard, for lack of a better term, mean in the Gaussian sense. More often than not, power law distribution only applies to the tail and not the actual thing. So let's say for firms that are bigger than 20 people, those follow a power law. And so in InfoSec, when we think about, say, the distribution of breaches or the distribution of attacks by CVE type, that should also be true. The ones that have only one attack on a particular CVE type probably don't fall into that distribution parameter. So on the slide behind me, and this is one of the few slides in this talk you actually have to pay attention to, there are examples of power law distributions. Take a look at the top left. There's cities, which follow power law distributions. There's earthquakes, and there's citation patterns. I think all of those are kind of good models for talking about breaches or attacks in information security. Firstly, cities, or the size of cities, will certainly affect how attackers and defenders interact because those have infrastructure that is being attacked or defended. Earthquakes are a good model because they're actually the loss functions for a natural phenomenon, but our loss function is eerily similar to that, actually. When I show you the distribution of breaches over time, or impact of breaches, that distribution looks a lot like that very middle one. And on the bottom right, you have citations. And so while that's not reflective itself, there's also email and all sorts of things that relate to information itself. And since what is being stolen or what is being breached for us is information, the fact that the distribution of the sizes or the frequency of this information is power law distributed is also a hint towards us not using normal distributions. So tails of these distributions are vitally important. A power law is an instance of what people call a fat-tailed or a long-tailed distribution, and this is just a loose term for something that as the order of magnitude or as the impact of the thing keeps getting bigger, the probability stays afloat. So there's never a zero, or almost never, a zero probability of some event happening in a power law distribution. That is to say, if what you think is the average amount of attacks on a particular type of CVE or against your business on a day is 10,000, in a normal distribution, the probability that it's 2 million is probably zero. In a power law distribution, that is a non-zero probability, and it will always be non-zero no matter what number you pick. And that's really important for us in modeling risk. And measuring those fat tails is what we're going to talk about. Measuring a fat tail is quite difficult. The data I'm going to show you, I'm not particularly great at measuring it. I use some regression models and least error estimators or minimizers. But that's not a scientifically sound way to do it. It gives you a proof that a power law might exist, but I think the fact that the tail is fat is sufficient in guiding the kind of decision processes that we make. Just the fact that it's not normal is enough for our discussion. The question of proving whether something is a power law is often reduced to just the question of how fat is the tail. And the fatter it is, both the more confident you can be that it's a power law distribution, and the more these strategic insights that I want to talk about hold true, I guess. So here's a comparison from Russell Thomas on his blog about a normal distribution, a log normal, and a Pareto, which is an instance of a power law. And when you look at them, at their initial scales, there doesn't seem to be much of a difference in the tails. But if you dig a little bit deeper, you can see that in the truncated Pareto distribution, the probabilities kind of asymptotically never hit zero. No matter which order of magnitude you go out to, there's some probability that that event will happen. Whereas in the normal and even in the log normal, at some point it hits zero. And that's the important takeaway, that you should expect the unexpected, and there's always some probability of a large event happening. But more interestingly, if you look at the mean of these distributions, as you get more data, and that's what this graph is showing, as you get more data, you can be more certain about the mean of a normal or a log normal distribution. But you can't say the same about a power law distribution. The mean follows a random walk process. You have no idea, if you get more data, whether the mean will stay the same or shift. And if you think about it intuitively in information security, that's been true over the past couple of years. We had this conception of what an average breach might look like, or we had a conception of what an average mechanism for a breach might look like. And as new methods keep coming out, or as new breaches occur, that mean shifts so wildly and moves up or sometimes down if we're talking about methods, so much that that past distribution wasn't really useful for our strategic decision making. And this is where a lot of businesses fail, because they rely on those old assumptions of what was happening rather than taking into account the new. So why does this matter? It's because when the tails are small, we can say meaningful things about the mean and also the variance of the distribution. So an interesting aspect of power laws in general, and a mathematical aspect, is that exponent, alpha, has a really natural interpretation as well. It's the cutoff above which moment-generating functions don't exist. And so what that really means is if it's less than 2, the variance probably doesn't exist for that distribution. And if it's less than 1, then the mean does not exist for that distribution. So for this reason, we can say things like, there's no such thing as an average flood, right? You've never heard somebody say the average flood is this much water. Instead, they say this is a 10-year flood or this is a 100-year flood. And my contention is that we should be thinking about losses in InfoSec in the same way. There's no such thing as an average loss amount. There's no such thing as an average dollar cost per record lost. There's instead a 10-year breach or a 100-year breach. So back in our own industry, why would information security exhibit such power law behavior, and where does it actually occur? So first, when two distributions are combined, the fattest tail always wins, which is to say if something is a factor of something that's normally distributed and power law distributed, that new thing will be power law distributed. If you think about it intuitively, then the things that make up the attacker-defender interaction in information security, if they're power law distributed, so should the results. And cities, the size of the internet, even the size of terrorist attacks are all power law distributed. Second, information security is not only the combination of those many factors, but it also makes the system more complex because we interact with it, right? We as defenders change the way in which attackers interact with the system. We go to these conferences and we share knowledge about it. So that has an exogenous effect on information security as well. We would expect it not only to inherit those variables, but also create this kind of complex behavior that people talk about power law being a fingerprint of, meaning that the tactics shift and the size of the landscape shifts constantly in such ways that distributions that would characterize it at a point in time don't really work. So let's talk about a couple of the takeaways that we have, and this is where I'm going to dive into the data that I have. The first law that I can prove with a lot of confidence is that breach frequency by CVE type is power law distributed. So This comes from the Open Threat Exchange, and this is data from Risk.io. And these are successful exploits over the past year. And I've grouped them by their CVE type. Why is that useful? It's because it tells you how your remediation practice should work or how you should think about the metrics in that remediation practice. So the chance that a particular CVE has a high breach volume is substantially higher than we previously thought, is what this tells us. It's just like in the Alex Hutton example, that the SAP drops by 21%. You would underestimate it significantly if you were to say a new CVE came out and, based on the prior distribution of CVEs, chances are the risk that it poses to my organization falls somewhere in this range. That's just not true, and the assessments have to be done as they come out and in terms of other data, namely about what's happening in real time. I have a different talk that I gave last year here, which is about why CVSS scores don't particularly work, and this is a good way to conceptualize that. Power law distributions are scale invariant and time invariant, so as the amount of breaches per CVE type, or the importance of defending against a particular CVE, changes over time, a CVSS score is just a snapshot of what people thought that was at the time. It's probably, in fact, it is drawn from a normal distribution if you look at the way that the scores were conceived originally. Whereas the way we should be thinking about these now is there's a non-zero chance and likely a high chance that a new CVE type might see 1 million breaches in the next month or 2 million breaches in the next month, something that a normal distribution of CVE scores just couldn't conceptualize. For those technically minded, the X-min cutoff for this is 15, so that means if there's less than 15 breaches per day on a particular CVE, it doesn't follow a power law distribution, and that's probably because they're just super targeted attacks or things that are super hard to exfiltrate. They're not things that have exploit code or have metasploits written against them. The alpha is 1.5, and the confidence in this test is 0.9, which is the Kolmogorov-Smirnov d-value, which is the way that you test for whether something is a power law not visually. But visually, this one is pretty much a power law, and that value falls within the cutoff of saying, yeah, we can accept the hypothesis that this follows a power law distribution. Regardless of whether it does or not, though, the tail is really fat, and we should start thinking about CVEs that way. So what does this mean for you? It means that one vulnerability will have an extremely high probability of causing a breach, or a group of vulnerabilities. And since this breach data comes from how attackers are actually behaving, it means that having a handle on threat intelligence globally allows you to identify which vulnerabilities are most likely to cause those breaches. This also means that that intelligence needs to be fairly real time, or you're lagging behind and you'll never expect the high probability CVEs. It means that you have to shift your strategy away from trying to fix everything or trying to assume that there's some kind of average risk that a vulnerability poses to your environment, and instead focus on identifying and remediating vulnerabilities which are the most likely to cause a breach. And framing your risk management practice or framing your evaluation of vulnerabilities in terms of which one is most likely to cause a breach is nonlinear thinking driven by these power law distributions, and that's really what I want to impart with the difference between what I think a lot of us assume and what is actually happening. The second law is about actual breach sizes. Kevin Thompson has a talk tomorrow at 2 p.m., and this talk talks about, there he is, talks about the Veris Community Database. It's a research project aimed at gathering all the news articles about information security and trying to get some data about how big those breaches are. And he in his talk also supposes that this is a power law distribution. If you just look at this analytically, it looks to follow a power law distribution. And what does this mean? This is by record count in a breach that they found in the news. So there's other proof of this that has been around for a while, but people don't really look at it. Maliart and Soren from ETH Zurich in 2009 looked at data loss DB, and they looked at ID theft frequency. So their idea of a record was not whatever data. It was either a social security number or a credit card, something that caused actual financial impact. And they looked at all the incidents where they had those metrics, and they found that this follows a power law extremely well, and they have really nice proofs that you can look up. What's interesting to note here is that the alpha is stably 0.7, and what that means is that there's no mean whatsoever. There's no way to characterize the average amount of financial damage or ID theft that can be caused by a breach. There's also no way to characterize the standard deviation. This is one of those power laws that's terrifyingly hard to predict anything about the future. What's also interesting is that if you look at the impact of terror attacks globally over time, that also follows an extremely stable distribution of 0.08. And it's not surprising that the two are closely linked, because both involve attacker-defender interactions where you have to have some intelligence about the opponent, and you might not, and you might be messing up how you actually do it. Another interesting finding from their paper is that if you separate by industry, and they don't have that many, they just have like industry, government, education, and medical, nothing changes. And that finding is really interesting. It also extends to the size of the firms, actually, but I don't have the graph for that. That finding is really interesting because it means that as the sizes of firms go up, or maybe as the types go up or down, I don't know whether government is above or below medicine, but as those things shift, so do the ways that attackers interact with them. Meaning that if you're a really large bank and you have a really great security practice, the end result, or the residual risk exposure that you're faced with, is likely the same as a small organization with a much shittier security practice, just because you're a bigger target of opportunity for attackers. So that's why this kind of scale-free phenomenon exists. It's because the attackers are interacting with your firm size or with the type of firm that you have, much in the same way that you are. So, your budget is bigger, they're targeting you more. That's not their motivation for attacking you more, but those things just seem to correlate in such a way that regardless of what industry or size you're in, this seems to be the case. So what do those things mean about the impact or record sizes of breaches? Those are just some ways of modeling impact. Lots of people have other ones. But it's safe to say that if these are somehow have a really fat tail, then the actual losses that you will find by incorporating more factors will also have a fat tail for the previous reasons of combining two distributions. You have to keep that fat tail. So the takeaway here is that impact is concentrated in the fat tails of the distributions as well. So both the probability of the attack path and of the impact is concentrated in the fat tail of the distribution. And that means that our strategies need to be tailored to preventing one big breach. This also means that there's no average breach, and estimates of potential losses need to be catering to those scenarios, like the Black Monday example that we missed in the opening example, rather than catering to something average or the average day in security. This is also a really useful way to talk to the C-level about what's happening in information security. You might have an average snapshot of how much risk or what the last breach cost you, and that might be driving your budgets. But the real argument is that that's not descriptive of what might happen tomorrow, and that's not descriptive because we have a lot of data about how that's shifted over time and how those distributions look. And the last takeaway is that the breach frequency by day also follows a power law distribution, eerily similar to the CVE distribution. So what this means is that the amount of breaches or successful exploits that happen on any given day, also the highest frequency things are concentrated in the fat tail of this distribution. And the combination of these three things, I suppose, means that both the vector by which you'll be attacked, the impact of that attack, and the frequency of how those attacks happen have no average value and are concentrated in the fat tails of the distributions. That means that your strategies need to shift accordingly. And I have some of my own ideas as to how those strategies should shift, but Russell Thomas writes an excellent blog post about it, and I'm going to go through the points of his that I think are the smartest about what fat tails imply for analysts and decision makers. So his first point is that the methods of statistical data analysis that are frequentist or based on historical data need to be augmented by other things. I think this talk, or the data in this talk, is one of those other things that you could augment your frequentist analysis with. You could say, historically we've seen this, but Reutemann gave a talk last year at BSides, and it indicates that that historical picture is not sufficient to capture our simulations, or to capture what will happen in the future. The next point is that you could also run simulations to augment it. You could run lab experiments or just use subjective probability estimates, of which this is probably one. The second recommendation he has is to resist using colloquial terms like average, typical, worst case, and I think I've tried to drive that point home throughout that talk, that those things just add confusion and misunderstanding, and most importantly, they add an underestimation of the amount of risk that you're dealing with. Communicate and decide using quantiles and not summary statistics. So the mean and the standard deviation don't mean much in most information security settings. And so saying something like, the probability of a 10-year breach is this, or the probability of a $100 million breach is this, is a lot more useful than saying the average one has some fixed dollar amount assigned to it. I then put some effort into estimating what the fatness of that tail is. And so there's a really nice R package called Power R Law that you can just throw in a bunch of the data like I did, and it'll give you good outputs that you can then think about whether it's an actual power law or not based on your understanding of the data. But more importantly than this, just try to see if you have a distribution of something that you're dealing with, or you have some historical data, plot it out on a log-log scale, try to see if it actually has a thin or a fat tail. It's intuitively really easy to tell, and if it's closer to the fat tail, then you're probably making some assumptions using that data that shouldn't hold. And so let's talk about the 4 things I've written up there. They're like the only things that I've written on the slides whatsoever. Investing time to fix 100% of your vulnerabilities is just a terrible idea. You need to model your risk differently because the way that you end up dealing with the residual risk indicates that you're modeling it poorly. It indicates that those large probability breach events keep happening and keep growing in size, and the impacts keep growing in size, and the attack paths keep changing in such a way that there's always more attack. There's constantly large numbers of automated attacks happening on different CVEs. When the big loss event happens, only 1 or a few vulnerabilities will be exploited, and to stay ahead of them, what you need to do is you need to fix a portfolio of vulnerabilities that try to encompass the things that you think are in that fat tail of distribution. That way you're driving down risk the most. So to think about this strategically, you know that the things that are most useful to attackers, or the things that frequently are gaining them the biggest impact and the most success, are somewhere in the fat tail of distribution. And you need to find ways to characterize what resides in that fat tail. So interestingly enough, the historical quote-unquote data analysis that I did in drafting these distributions tells you which of those CVEs have the highest breach counts, right? That comes from a bunch of threat intelligence that we have at Risk.io that tells us that looking at the landscape, the things that are in the fat tail of the distribution are this. There are other factors that you might use to figure this out. So let's say you analyze your network traffic and you find that there are some things that are happening a large amount of time that are targeting something specific. That might give you a clue as to what things are being most successful, or similarly, what things have been most successful. So the last thing that I want to leave you with is that I've shown 3 facets that I think are important, and they're important to vulnerability management, they're important to risk management. That is probability, or attack path, attack impact, and attack type. And those things, while I might have some proof that they're power law distributed, are not the only things that are. Meaning that likely the reason that I'm finding these things, and likely the reason that I can give you statistical analysis that proves or doesn't prove that it's a power law, is that the system is complex in such a way that most things in it are power law distributed. So never use an average metric. Think about how it's distributed and realize that something like average vulnerabilities closed, or average score reduction, or the average attacks per days probably don't mean anything because the system interacts in a statistically complex way where those types of statistics just don't apply. That's it.
Okay, so we're going to move on to questions.
I have t-shirts for questions.
And he has t-shirts for questions.
And I'm spilling my
So
beer.
if you have a question or just want a t-shirt, ask a question. And I'll give you this microphone so you can be heard.
So, oh wow. So my
Use one of those to wipe my hands. Yeah, go ahead.
okay. So my question is, you talk about talking to the C-level, and one of the things that you constantly hear back from the C-level is, they want the average because they want to know how much to spend. How do you convert that into a spend? Right. We can go back and go, yeah, you've got to pay attention to this, and this is the real metric we should be using. But from what it sounds like, I need infinite spend, and they're not going to like that.
Yeah, I don't think it's infinite spend, right? These things approach some kind of asymptotical zero or don't really ever hit that zero. But I think you could say that realistically we're not concerned with the $1 billion loss because our company doesn't cost that much. The most, like you say, the most we could ever lose is this much. And if we model our losses as a power law distribution leading up to that, just cut it off there, find the area under that curve, that's the amount. And I think if you look at that, that amount will be orders of magnitude bigger than what you're currently dealing with. And I think the easier way to convert it is just to say, look, I modeled this one particular point. and here, like the example I gave at the beginning. So here's the $100 million breach on the distribution I'm using to tell you the average. Here's what it is if I can't really convey that average to you. Tell me how you want me to act, right?
So basically how much money you want to lose.
Yeah, exactly that. And I think the argument that this talk makes is that you're going to lose a lot more money than you think continuously throughout the fat tail.
Thank you.
Kim?
So this is a lot of pretty advanced math for a lot of response organizations. Whether they're, funded for this or not is another question. So if you were to boil down here's the stuff you need to worry about most into, the key takeaways, have you distilled it down to that level for the teams that can't do this level of analysis on their data? Like what would your go-to recommendations be for somebody who's like, crap, I'm doing it wrong, but I don't know how to fix that?
Yeah, I think, no, so I haven't distilled it, right? That's something I'm struggling with as well. But I think what I can tell you is that these things are mostly publicly available data, right? And you don't need to rerun the analysis. You can just say, Kevin and Michael analyzed the open source databases and they find that the record distributions look like this. How you distill the high-level math is a different question, right? How you convey the difference in those distributions. But I think in terms of which factors or how you run that analysis, I don't know if you really need to. I think you can just say, I suspect it's way worse because it looks like this.
I just know, most of the people who stayed through this full talk, we're data nerds. We get this. But then when you take it back and you're trying to translate it to the decision makers and explain to them, it's not about average number of vulnerabilities closed. It's about closing the right vulnerabilities. It's being able to communicate that in an actionable way.
Right. So, yeah, I agree with you, and I'm completely open to ideas of how to distill how to take away the math, right? How to simplify it. I think that's not just a question for me. That's a question for statisticians everywhere. To me, it's just like the examples that have actually happened is the best way to do it. Without talking about the distributions at all, right? To you, I've proven that is the case, but to the C-level, I think what matters is look, Black Friday happened once. Look, Target wasn't accounted for in these previous distributions.
It was a great talk. Thank you.
I think actually the flood analogy and things that non-security professionals understand by analogy is the real answer to her question. In other words, don't even deal with the math, basically. The takeaway is something else in their lives they understand and they've had experience with that basically are dealing with what they would consider to be rare events that really aren't that rare.
Yeah, and actually, as you said, the earthquake one is really good too because it has a scale built into it, right? So you could say, on our security Richter scale, we're looking at this. We're only going to focus on these.
Okay, so I'll give you 2 questions. You can answer whichever one you want.
I'll try to answer both.
Maybe. So do you think that there's a relationship between the power law distribution and paths through a graph? That's the first question. The other is, what do you think the relationship is between the existence of power law distributions in information security problems and free will or rational actors, kind of those economic concepts?
Those are both really good questions. So to the first one, I don't know enough graph theory, right? I think that question actually has an answer that we could Google.
Based on what?
Is that like fake nodes? Okay. Oh, wait. I have a list of references here, and one thing that will answer your... Well, if you want to do this or something, there's more too, but feel free to email me. The last one, the Dan Geer talk, he actually talks about the node network of the internet and how it propagates itself. And so one of the arguments that he makes for why malware or for why attacks travel so well and follow a power law distribution is because of that those node connections. So the things that make the internet really good are also the things that make the internet really good at being bad, essentially, is the argument there. In terms of, are these power laws economic? Yeah, I think so, but I also don't know if there's a real answer to whether economic power laws are economic or factors of city-state power laws or, naturalistic power laws and, like, where you can build a city and how big can it be.
Hi. So I'm somewhere in between statistician or data scientist and an instant responder. So my question is pretty much along the lines of within InfoSec, given you talked about all the different industries and different use cases, how they still generally follow a power law. But even within InfoSec, given that there's different spheres, like within the kill chain, there's different things to look at over there. Have you kind of spliced it into that level of granularity and seeing like that type of analysis and breaking down your data, or is it just pretty much here's us overall sum of what we're looking at?
Correct me, stop me anytime if I'm misunderstanding the question. But I think when we talk about breach impact, that's the terminal distribution. That's the one that's the combination of all the previous ones and all the previous steps of, like, how did your incident response team do? How did your vulnerability management team do? How did dev interact with this environment? The end game of that is the breach power law. And if that one follows a really fat tail distribution of 0.07, there are other factors that are contributing to fattening that tail, which means there's some step in that kill chain that's causing it to be such a fat tail. What that is an awesome thing for us to find out in the next 10 years.
Okay, that's pretty much the question. Like within the kill chain, does that take into account, like, is it mostly
Right, so I don't take that into account, right? I work in vulnerability management. That's the data I have. I can tell you that our power laws seem to be about at a 1.5 coefficient. They don't have standard deviations. They might have a mean or might not have a mean. The terminal ones are 0.07. So there's something else in the kill chain that's probably worse than vulnerability management.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Thank you.
So when you were, oh, by the way, great talk. I tip my hat to you if I was wearing one.
You as well. I saw your slides.
Oh, thank you. So when you look at the Varus community database and the slope there, you're looking at every industry that we have and every size of an organization that we have and stuff. So if somebody was trying to apply this, yeah, that one right there. If somebody was trying to apply this in their own organization, is it fair to use that and that slope, or do they really need to kind of localize more? And this is kind of going back to her question, where she was talking about how can we take the math out of it, and I'm wondering, actually, can we really take the math out of it, or do you really need to do this analysis within your own organization and on breaches affecting organizations similar to you? So I'd like your opinion on that.
Kim?
Right. Right. Right.
So I'm going to give you two answers. The first one is one I disagree with. But so there's a theoretical argument that I make at some point here, and it's like, look at these other people have found that the power laws are consistent throughout industry, so you shouldn't really worry about it, right? We found this factor across industries, and also there's another argument that says that you can decompose them and they'll stay the same. And then, combine those two logical things into a syllogism and you're good to go. I don't really agree with that in practice because, I would prefer to have data about those things. So that's the kind of shitty answer of yeah, it applies to everything. But the better answer is that what's awesome about power laws is that they're scale invariant. And so the same mechanism is at work means that if we find that mechanism is at work on the global scale, it is true that it is also at work on your scale. Hopefully. If we prove them correctly, right? We could be completely wrong about the power law. It's actually something else, and then for you, it doesn't work that way.
Okay, I actually have a question myself. So you mentioned that we shouldn't use averages, and of course that's true of essentially using that centrality estimator for anything that's not a normal distribution, right? So you shouldn't be using averages for anything that doesn't have a bell curve shape anyway. But doesn't the field of robust estimation, like using medians, you mentioned using percentiles or quantiles, which are of course derivative of the median, doesn't that generally provide a tool that can be applied kind of generically? I mean, obviously medians are the safest centrality estimator out there. That's why For example, the U.S. Census has changed to using medians for all their centrality estimation. And there's some pairwise, as a follow-on question, there's some pairwise distance-based, there's something called the Crew-Roussois estimator for anyone that's touched that, that's based on basically, just taking the pairwise distances between all your points that can give you a notion of dispersion over any data set. It's a robust estimator of dispersion. So it works on single-tailed, it works on fat-tailed distributions. I was curious if you've touched on any of those kind of median estimation problems.
I think I just conceptualized what you meant by the point one. I don't really see its inherent value right now, but that's just because it's the first time I've heard of it. But quantiles, yeah, I think the easiest strategic thing you can take from this is use quantiles instead of averages, and you'll be better off right away. To say this is in the 90th percentile of things that pose risk to us or things that we should be fixing is what I'm trying to advocate for here, right? I think that's the solution. Yeah. And I think what I see with a lot of our customers and what I see with a lot of literature that I read in InfoSec is people are still using averages. Or they're using metrics that presuppose that the average is a good outcome, which is not true. I'd like to see somebody talk about the 90th percentile of vulnerability close rates as their metric for operations, but it just doesn't happen.
I mean, I recently reviewed a paper where somebody was actually using the average and the variance for a Zipfian distribution, which is just absurd, right? So I understand the problem, but it is definitely broad spread, and it kind of makes you wonder if security got into the practice of being careful with its use of stuff like medians, we would probably save ourselves a lot of pain today, trying to communicate messages. Because, I mean, CEOs understand medians, right? They understand this kind of basic stats, quantiles, and percentiles.
So I think there's also a good distance estimator between what you said and what was said here. It's that, we need to figure out the method that replaces the average that is also the most simple and most accessible.
Okay, are there any other questions? Sorry to hog the mic there. Okay, well, let's thank Mike for, wait, we have one in the back?
Okay. No, I have not. And intuitively to me, the losses that I'm talking about are not organizational losses that happen after the fact. They're actual loss of data or records, right? That's why I'm never talking about dollar amount. Well, I said it in my talk, but it was like a reflexive instinct to talk about dollar amounts. I think the translation from a breach, what the breach actually did to your organization, to the dollar amount is a question that is better saved for the keynote. I know nothing about that. Or for that dude.
Just a comment on that, having read some of that research, don't confuse the fact that you actually have material long-term impact, the fact that they do not have impact. They still lost $250 million in that breach. That's pointing people nuts. Right? So it's just not, it just didn't scale with the other losses that they occurred. Business quarters from having closed down stores and all the other factors that went along with the depression in Tuscany. Target similarly, the market's built in a $1.2 billion negative valuation of Target for the years. But as you look at the breach, sure, that's a cost. They were also suffering costs of failure in Canada. Right? So it's not easy to take that external-based research versus internal-based research. Very rough pseudo-activity as cost around that cost. You get that $250 million cost. Then it's up to executives to say, yeah, I care about that or I don't. Or that's a bad day, but I think here's some money to reduce that investment. To reduce that risk as an investment. I don't know if I heard your question correctly, but that is very different.
I have another theory. It's that if you probably look at the stuff that happened financially after the fact, like maybe the numbers are reduced and maybe like who got impacted more shifts around, but that probably also still follows a power law distribution. Because the ways that firms deal internally with that actual loss is subject to the same problems of distribution analysis.
Hey, great. Well, let's give Mike a big thank you, and we'll go on next stage. Okay, next up, we've got Alex Pinto and Kyle Maxwell. You guys got about 5 minutes, so if you want to cycle in and out.